Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today, we are diving into the forgotten storm before the siege, a time when two mighty empires, Britain and Spain, clashed not just over land or honor, but over ideas, trade, and the very architecture of global power. Now, to really understand what unfolded at Cartagena, we need to set the stage. Picture Europe in the early 1700s. The War of the Spanish Succession has just ended. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in 1713, was supposed to bring peace. But as is so often the case with treaties, it planted as many seeds of conflict as it resolved. You see, Britain walked away from Utrecht with more than just paper promises. It gained limited trade rights in Spanish America, specifically, the right to sell slaves under something called the asiento. Yes, a contract for human cargo. And that contract gave Britain a foot in the door, but not full access to the riches of the Spanish Empire. So what did Britain do? It pushed, it probed, and it irritated Spain in ways that would soon come back to bite. This tension didn't exist in a vacuum. At the time, Europe's economy was structured around a philosophy called mercantilism. Imagine a zero-sum game. If Spain grew rich from Caribbean gold and trade routes, that meant Britain couldn't. So naturally, both empires threw everything they had into securing monopolies and squeezing competitors out. They weren't just fighting over treasure, they were fighting over the rules of the game. Britain, ever the ambitious empire, had its sights set on more than just trade agreements. It wanted dominance. It wanted to flex its naval muscle and dictate the flow of global commerce. But ambition without clarity often leads to chaos, and as we'll see later, that ambition had consequences. On the other side, Spain wasn't sitting idly by. It knew its empire was a shimmering target, and so, it fortified heavily. Spain invested in a complex web of ports and fortresses throughout the Caribbean. Cartagena de Indias, in modern-day Colombia, became a jewel in that defensive crown. Spain knew that if it lost cities like Cartagena, the entire western flank of its empire could crumble. So here we are, two empires locked in a slow boil. Britain, pushing outward with growing confidence. Spain, digging in with iron walls and seasoned commanders. The Caribbean was no longer just a sea. It had become a chessboard for empires. And as with any good historical chess match, the next move would be both brilliant and disastrous. Let's fast forward to 1741. Britain, fed up with Spanish interference and itching to enforce its imperial will, decides to make its move. But not just any move. This was an all-in, no-holds-barred, full-scale amphibious assault. Britain launched what was, at the time, the largest naval expedition it had ever assembled. Picture it, 186 ships, 27,000 men. That's not a fleet, that's a floating city. Their mission? To crush Spanish resistance in the Caribbean and seize Cartagena, one of the most important Spanish ports in the Americas. On paper, this was the definition of overwhelming force. But history isn't written on paper, it's written in chaos, confusion, and human error. And that's exactly what plagued this mission from the start. You see, Britain's centralized planning looked good from a distance. Everything was tightly controlled, highly coordinated, and completely inflexible. The campaign was directed from far-off command structures that didn't understand the terrain, didn't adapt to local conditions, and frankly didn't leave much room for improvisation. In other words, they brought the wrong tools to the wrong battlefield. But it wasn't just poor logistics, it was the personalities at the top that added fuel to the fire. Admiral Edward Vernon and Governor Edward Trelawney were both men of ambition. Vernon wanted a decisive military victory to boost his status back home. Trelawney had colonial interests and political aspirations. Each man believed his plan was the key, and instead of rowing in the same direction, they ended up pulling the mission apart from within. There's a deeper lesson here, a systems-level failure where power wasn't the problem. Coordination was. These leaders weren't incentivized to work together, they were incentivized to win alone. And when personal prestige takes priority over shared purpose, even a fleet of nearly 200 ships can feel rudderless. So while Britain looked like a superpower on the surface, underneath the deck, cracks were forming. Cracks made of overconfidence, logistical overreach, and a misalignment of goals. And yet, they set sail into the Caribbean, into enemy territory, and straight into one of the most underappreciated military disasters of the 18th century. But what, or who, was waiting for them in Cartagena? Let's move to the next slide to find out. Now, let's talk about the man who stood between the British Empire and total control of the Caribbean, a man you've probably never heard of, but should never forget. His name was Blas de Lezo, and if this were a movie, you'd think his character was too dramatic to be real. He had one eye, one leg, and one functioning arm. A man quite literally held together by grit and scars. But don't let the injuries fool you, for Blas de Lezo was sharp, calculating, and absolutely brilliant. At the time of the British assault, he He was the commanding officer tasked with defending Cartagena. And what he lacked in limbs, he more than made up for in foresight. His strategy wasn't just about brute defense, it was about engineering a trap. De Lezo understood Cartagena's geography better than anyone. He knew that if the British attacked with all their force, they would overextend themselves, and he built a defense designed to make them pay for it. Let's break that down. Cartagena wasn't protected by just one fortress, it was a system of layered defenses. The crown jewel was the San Felipe de Barajas fortress, perched atop a hill and designed to control movement through the city. But that was just the beginning. Each layer of the city's defenses was engineered to funnel attackers into choke points, slow their momentum, and bleed their numbers before they ever got close to the city's heart. This wasn't a top-down, one-size-fits-all strategy. De Lezo empowered his local commanders to make decisions on the ground, what we'd call a decentralized tactical response. They used the terrain to their advantage, muddy fields, winding paths, defensive trenches, and responded dynamically as the battle shifted. And that flexibility? It proved devastatingly effective against the rigid, centrally planned British operation. There's something deeper at play here. What Spain had built wasn't just a wall, it was a living, breathing doctrine. Their defense wasn't simply about steel and stone. It was about adaptability, redundancy, and resilience. This wasn't luck. It was design. Spain had learned over time that centralized empires were only as strong as their ability to respond to the unpredictable. Blas de Lezo didn't just defend Cartagena. He embodied a philosophy of war that favored knowledge, preparation, and empowerment over sheer size. His defense was less like a fortress and more like a web, flexible, layered, and lethal to anyone who stepped into it unprepared. And as you're about to see, the British walked straight into it. So here we are, the mighty British fleet has arrived. Hundreds of ships dot the horizon. Thousands of men disembark, ready to storm the jewel of Spain's Caribbean empire. This was supposed to be a quick, glorious victory, a showcase of British strength. But almost immediately, things start to fall apart. Let's start with the most underestimated enemy of all, the environment. British soldiers, many of whom had never seen the tropics, were quickly overwhelmed by the brutal Caribbean climate. The heat was relentless, the humidity was stifling, and worst of all, disease spread like wildfire. Within days, malaria and yellow fever were ripping through the ranks. Poor sanitation didn't help. Latrines overflowed, drinking water was contaminated, and medical care was rudimentary at best. Before the first major shots were even fired, men were dropping, not from bullets, but from bacteria. And while the British were melting under the sun, Blas de Lezo was calmly playing his next move. He didn't meet force with force. He met it with intelligence. Picture this, the British dig trenches to approach the fortress, classic siege warfare. But overnight, the Spanish flood those trenches with water. Ambushes hit supply convoys, morale tanks. The British, used to conventional rules of war, were now fighting an enemy that played by none of them. This wasn't just clever, it was psychological. Lezo turned Cartagena into a labyrinth of fear. British troops couldn't sleep, couldn't move without being watched. They began second-guessing every step, every decision. Slowly, they lost not just ground, but confidence. Meanwhile, back in the British camp, the gears of command were grinding to a halt. Officers argued, supplies ran short, and day by day, the losses mounted. Casualties from disease, from ambushes, from bad decisions. Coordination broke down. Orders contradicted each other. Some commanders wanted to push forward, others urged retreat. And just like that, the British war machine collapsed under its own weight. In contrast, the Spanish defense held firm. They didn't need superior numbers. They had superior strategy. Asymmetric warfare, using speed, terrain, psychology, and morale, proved more potent than any cannon barrage. Every failed British assault only strengthened the defenders' resolve. Every delay bought more time for Lezo's decentralized tactics to work their magic. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. The British withdrew, battered, humiliated, and haunted by the very city they thought would be their triumph. Cartagena had become a graveyard not of men, but of arrogance. When the cannons fell silent and the British fleet limped away, it wasn't just a military failure, it was a wake-up call. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The British Empire had mobilized its greatest amphibious force to date, and in return, it gained nothing but disease, disorder, and defeat. And back in London, the ripple effects of that failure hit hard. First came the imperial re-evaluation. British leaders, stunned by the debacle, were forced to confront something they'd been avoiding: their empire was not invincible. The loss at Cartagena exposed the limits of central planning, of throwing men and metal at a problem without understanding the deeper systems at play. Suddenly, expansion didn't look like destiny, it looked like risk. Overextension was no longer a hypothetical, it had a name, a place, and a body count. Then came the political fallout. At home, the war party, the political faction pushing for aggressive imperial intervention, lost credibility almost overnight. Parliament erupted in criticism. The public, already tired of war taxes and hearing tales of far-off conquests, began to question the wisdom of chasing glory at such a high cost. The Cartagena campaign didn't just lose ships, it lost political momentum. It turned military might into political liability. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, Spain was riding high. Cartagena's defense became a symbol of resilience. It wasn't just a military win, it was a psychological one. Spanish prestige surged. The empire's grip on New Granada, which had been wavering, suddenly tightened. The people believed again. And for Spain's leaders, the victory at Cartagena became proof that adaptability and localized strategy could triumph over brute force. But perhaps the most profound impact was less visible. It was the lesson. The Cartagena episode illuminated something that's often overlooked in the study of power: the strength of decentralized systems. Where Britain had relied on rigid top-down command, Spain had empowered local commanders. Where the British chain of command collapsed under stress, the Spanish system bent but didn't break. The outcome wasn't just about tactics, it was about how knowledge flowed, who made decisions, and whether those decisions were shaped by immediate context or distant assumption. Cartagena forced imperial strategists to ask a hard question: what if smaller, more adaptive systems could outperform massive ones? What if less control sometimes meant more success? It's a question that still echoes in today's world, where size and scale are often mistaken for strength. But at Cartagena, strength came from humility, from listening to the land, from trusting local knowledge, and from letting go of the illusion that control equals victory. By now, it should be clear that Cartagena wasn't just a battle, it was a case study in how systems succeed or collapse. And if we zoom out, we start to see the hidden machinery behind the outcome. Let's begin with fortifications, not just as physical barriers, but as institutions. San Felipe de Barojos and the surrounding network weren't just made of stone, they were made of knowledge. Every wall, every trench, every gun placement reflected years of experience, adaptation, and anticipation. These defenses weren't just built to stop bullets, they were built to absorb pressure, to stretch, to adapt. So, in a way, they became more than architecture. They became living expressions of how a decentralized empire like Spain could defend itself intelligently, not through size, but through design. Now compare that to the British strategy. Their strength was mass, overwhelming numbers, centralized coordination, top-down command. But here's the problem with mass: it hits diminishing returns, especially against an enemy that refuses to meet it head-on. That's where adaptability changes the equation. Spanish defenders used the terrain, local knowledge, and dynamic tactics to fragment and confuse the British advance. And suddenly, the British numbers didn't matter. Their force was neutralized, not through equal resistance, but through strategic redirection. Like a river hitting a canyon wall, their momentum simply broke. But let's talk about one of the most underappreciated forces in any empire: incentives. Why were the British commanders so out of sync? Because they weren't incentivized to win together. They were chasing personal glory, promotions, and headlines back home. Each decision was filtered through ego, ambition, and misaligned interests, and that tore the machine apart. Meanwhile, the Spanish defense was not perfect, but it aligned. It rewarded cohesion. Local commanders weren't seeking fame. They were defending homes, protecting families, holding ground that mattered to them. That brings us to something rarely captured in military textbooks: geographic morale advantage. Cartagena's defenders fought with the moral force of belonging. They weren't just stationed there, they lived there. They understood the hills, the tides, the humidity, the psychology of the terrain. They knew what was at stake. And that sense of ownership, of defending your homeland, not just executing a command, infused their actions with meaning. So when we put it all together, we see a powerful truth: size does not equal strength, control does not guarantee victory, and centralized power, without alignment, is often its own worst enemy. Cartagena wasn't just won in the trenches, it was won in the spaces between systems, where adaptability beat rigidity, where incentives aligned with mission, and where geography became a source of strength instead of a line on a map. As we wrap up this journey into the siege of Cartagena, it's worth pausing to ask the most important question of all. What does this moment in history actually teach us? First, historical significance. The 1741 siege wasn't just a military blunder, it was the largest failed amphibious assault until Gallipoli nearly 2 centuries later. That's how massive this operation was, and how total its failure became. It reshaped how European empires thought about projection of power, colonial defense, and the risk of assuming that military might always guarantee success. But Cartagena's real lesson isn't about war, it's about systems. Look at what worked. Not brute force, not sheer numbers, but adaptation, local knowledge, flexible command, and perhaps most importantly, aligned incentives. These defenders weren't just following orders, they were protecting something they believed in, something they knew, something they lived. That's why systemic thinking beat raw power. Blas de Lezo didn't win by overpowering the British. He won by outthinking them. He used terrain, weather, psychology, and architecture to tip the scales. His side wasn't the bigger machine, it was the better organized system, and that made all the difference. This raises moral implications. When we look at imperial history, at the conquest, colonization, and coercion that shaped the world, we often focus on who had the bigger army or the better weapons. But Cartagena reminds us that victory without legitimacy can crumble fast. That overwhelming force, when misused or misdirected, often collapses under its own weight. So here's the takeaway. History isn't driven by fate. It's shaped by choices, by designs, by how well our systems respond to uncertainty. Cartagena stands as proof that resilience isn't about being the strongest. It's about being the most responsive, the most adaptive, the most aligned. And that's why this story still matters today. Because every empire, past, present, or future, has to choose between control and flexibility, between power and wisdom, between looking strong and actually being resilient. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. If you found this breakdown engaging or insightful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to dive deeper into the hidden forces that shaped our world, check out my book History They Tried to Erase. You'll find the link in the description below. And hey, if you enjoy thoughtful, entertaining history that actually challenges the way we see the past, stick around. There's a lot more to uncover.